I've always been interested in the question of beauty, and this is a question that Dietrich von Hildebrand has shed a new light on. My interest in beauty is connected more fundamentally with Plato and the German philosophers, perhaps Kant, Hegel, and Schelling. But most fundamentally behind all of them is the work of Hans Urs von Balthasar. And as I think has come out in some discussions, there are very interesting points of intersection between von Hildebrand and Balthasar. So I was hoping to explore those connections with the people here. Oh, without question. The most interesting was the point that Professor Crosby has indicated is really Hildebrand's greatest achievement in aesthetics, what he calls the notion of beauty of the second power. And that's where you have a sensible experience of beauty, something that you perceive with your senses, but it seems to communicate something that couldn't possibly be contained in the senses. So it's this very curious paradox of a reality that conveys more than itself. And that notion of that kind of paradox is really central to Balthasar's theological aesthetics. It's precisely that dimension of things that is what makes beauty the proper, you might say, gateway from the natural to the specifically theological dimension of reality. And it seems to me that von Hildebrand and von Balthasar are really on the same page on that point. Oh, I mean, one could talk about this for hours, really. The paradox of the simultaneity of the inner depths of the reality of a thing that beauty makes manifest. That mystery is a mystery that belongs to the thing, but in some sense is also a mystery that's proper to being and proper to God, ultimately, most directly. And the intertwining of those realities is why, on the one hand, one doesn't need immediately to be thinking about God in order to open up experience into up to grace. In a certain sense, falling in love with a beautiful landscape is already a beginning. The opening doesn't have to be made explicit, but you can trust that it's there. And because it doesn't have to be made explicit, there's no rush to get to it. One can very calmly and contemplatively savor the beauty that one experiences, and one then discovers at the end of that it's precisely this thing that was delighting me so much that is opening me up to God. What an amazing gift that is, that God opens us to Himself precisely through something that delights us, rather than through deprivation or suffering. Of course, that can also be a path, but that's not the normal path. And it seems to me that the normal path is the path of beauty. One of the great tragedies of intellectual history that I think Balthasar and Hildebrand are in agreement about is what we might call forgetfulness of beauty. That Heidegger spoke very famously of the forgetfulness of being, and said some very profoundly important things about that. It seems to me that Balthasar and Hildebrand would say similar things about beauty, and in fact, Balthasar in particular would want to point out that those two oblivions are not unrelated. That one of the reasons we have forgotten being is because we've forgotten beauty, and as Hildebrand and Balthasar both say, beauty doesn't seem on the surface to be so serious. It's not something that one can be rigorous about, and one can define and delineate so readily. We appeal to the very obvious objectivity of truth, or the gravity of moral questions. And those are obviously crucial, but beauty, in a certain sense, it doesn't seem like so much is at stake. And for Balthasar, one of the reasons that it doesn't seem that way is not because it's superficial, but precisely because it's so profound that it's like the water to a fish. The fish doesn't realize that water is so important. Similarly, in human existence, we, in a certain sense, don't realize how important beauty is, and so it's especially in the modern era, for reasons that Balthasar presents in his main work. It can just disappear altogether. It can be reduced to all sorts of very trivial things and sentimentalized and so forth. Tragically, one of the places that I think beauty has suffered most is precisely among religiously minded people. We have a concern that taking delight in the sense experience of beauty is somehow self-indulgent, in that draws us away from God. It attaches us to the earth, we say, rather than to spiritual things, and so we need to be detached. But that seems to me that's all wrong. The mystery of God and the mystery of the world are inseparable. Exactly how that works out, one would have to spell out the details, and one can. There are many things to say, but at the end of the day, the inseparability of the mystery is crucial, and we end up, in fact, inevitably losing God if we lose beauty. We end up reducing God to simply a giver of moral precepts, or we reduce him to very, in a way, finite truths, rather than recognizing that truth and morality both have their home, in a way, in beauty. Well, holding seminars like this, I suppose, is one of the things. One of the things that has struck me being here. It's an extraordinary mix of people. We have academics, but then you have working artists, and everything then in between. So not only the theorizers, but the practitioners. And speaking with a sculptor today who teaches a course that involves both training in drawing and then supplemented by studying of texts. It seems to me that dual approach is a good lesson for us on this point. We need to think more about beauty. Some people think that beauty ought not to be thought about. It ought to be thought about, but not to the exclusion of the experience of beauty. Precisely the contrary, in the service of experiencing it better. And then we need to make beautiful things and recover this extraordinary tradition that we have, the inheritance of which has been squandered, to use Balthasar's language, really regrettably. There's so many resources to draw on in our creation of beauty, and it seems to me that both dimensions, the producing and the receiving, and the interpreting, coming to understand what beauty is, all of those are of a piece. I think we can't rest with the "they won't care" message, because it's understandable. Theorizing about precious things can sometimes put off those who love those things, because there's a good way to theorize and there's a bad way. One can impose theories. One can reductively rationalize an experience. But it's also possible, and in fact I think necessary, to learn to think about these kinds of things in a way that genuinely opens them up. And that's a responsibility that the academics have, and then on the other side, the practitioners of art, then I think they have a responsibility to care about these things. And it's important to recognize that caring is not something that is imposed. I mean, as happens in so many of these, if in fact they are interested in making something beautiful, that motivation itself already carries the seed of all of this. That doesn't have to be introduced from the outside. I've found it interesting in friends of mine who are recently married or are getting married. You often see them, for very practical reasons, we'll start talking about how to raise children, and suddenly things that they haven't really thought about or cared about maybe for a while, like religious instruction, suddenly they begin to think, well, maybe it is important to go to Mass. Now, why is that? They're practical matters that impose that, but it seems to me that falling in love with a person in a way that makes a claim on the whole of your life naturally raises these larger questions, because you were precisely talking about the whole of your life. That happens in marriage, but I think it can also happen in art. An artist who deeply and passionately loves to paint, and maybe loves to paint particular kinds of things, that in itself, if it really is a love, and a response to the beauty of the thing, that naturally will open up to these larger existential questions to such an extent that I think one can say, with some care of course, that if the person simply rejects that, it's going to damage the quality of their artistic endeavors. If it is positively excluded, it doesn't necessarily have to be explicitly part of it, but the moment the artist says, I have no interest in the religious dimension of the beauty that I seek, the moment he says it's excluded, things are going to change, and not for the better, I would think.